She fired him at 8 in the morning. By noon, her entire airline was about to collapse, and the only person who could save it was already walking out the parking lot with a cardboard box under his arm. 22 aircraft, billions of dollars, hundreds of jobs, a family legacy spanning 3 generations, and Claire Whitmore had just dismissed the one man who had quietly, invisibly, kept every single one of those planes in the air. She didn't know it yet. That was the worst part. Quote, "If you've never seen a story where the person everyone ignored turned out to be the person holding everything together, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will remind you why the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one to lose." Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The maintenance hangar at Whitmore Aviation smelled the way it always did. Jet fuel, machine oil, and something faintly metallic that stuck to the back of your throat if you stood in there long enough. At 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, most of the administrative staff hadn't arrived yet. The executive floor above the terminal was dark. The coffee in the break room hadn't even been started. But Caleb Mercer had been there since 4. He was on his back under the forward landing gear assembly of a Bombardier CRJ-900, a flashlight clamped between his teeth, his fingers working a torque wrench into a position that required a specific combination of patience and stubbornness that most people didn't have at any hour, let alone before sunrise. A yellow legal pad sat on the concrete floor beside him, covered in handwriting so small and precise it looked like typeset text. Numbers, measurements, notes that cross-referenced 3 separate maintenance logs going back 11 months. He'd been tracking a vibration anomaly in the nose gear on this particular aircraft for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of documenting, testing, submitting reports, and watching those reports get acknowledged with a thumbs-up emoji from someone in the operations office and then apparently dissolve into the atmosphere. The anomaly was subtle. The kind of thing a pilot might not feel until the conditions were exactly wrong. The kind of thing that didn't show up on a quick pre-flight because it only materialized under a specific torque load at a specific speed range during rollout. The kind of thing that an experienced mechanic noticed because he'd learned over 14 years that aircraft didn't lie. They just required someone willing to listen. Caleb pulled himself out from under the gear assembly, sat up, and made another notation on the pad. Across the hangar, Danny Okafor was climbing down from a rolling scaffold beside one of the 737s. Danny was 26, 3 years into the job, and he'd attached himself to Caleb the way younger mechanics sometimes attach themselves to the ones who actually knew what they were doing. Not in an annoying way. In the way of someone who understood that some knowledge didn't live in textbooks. "You're here early," Danny said, though he didn't sound particularly surprised. "Same time as always. It's 4 in the morning, man. 4:17. Danny shook his head and crouched down to look at what Caleb had written. He couldn't read half of it. "Is that the nose gear on the Bombardier again?" "Yep. You filed on that twice already. 3 times. "And?" Caleb looked at him. "And I'm filing again." Danny straightened up and glanced toward the glass-walled office at the far end of the hangar, empty at this hour, the lights off, the blinds half drawn. That was Victor Langley's office, operations director, the man whose signature had to appear on any maintenance schedule above a certain dollar threshold. "Victor's not going to like it," Danny said. "Victor doesn't have to like it. He has to respond to it." "That's not really how it works around here." Caleb didn't answer that because Danny wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. The thing about Whitmore Aviation was that it had once been, genuinely, a good company. Gerald Whitmore had founded it 31 years ago with 2 leased propeller aircraft and a contract to service 3 regional airports in the mid-Atlantic. He was a pilot himself, and he ran the company the way pilots tend to think about aircraft, with a kind of respect that bordered on reverence. Planes were not machines to be squeezed for margin. They were complex, demanding things that rewarded care and punished negligence without exception and without mercy. Gerald had died 4 years ago. His daughter Claire had taken over. Claire Whitmore was 38 years old, and she was not her father. That wasn't entirely her fault. She'd been trained in finance and operations strategy, not in the particular culture of aviation maintenance. She understood balance sheets and investor relations and brand positioning. She'd grown up watching her father spend money on the hangar the way other men spent money on golf, and she'd always thought privately that there had to be a smarter way to run things. Victor Langley had been happy to show her that smarter way. He'd come in 18 months ago with credentials that looked impressive on paper and a presentation that made operational efficiency sound like the answer to every problem the company had. He'd cut the maintenance budget by 22% in his first 6 months. He'd restructured the reporting chain so that maintenance concerns flowed through his office before reaching anyone in senior leadership. He'd introduced a new metric system that measured the aviation maintenance team's performance almost entirely on turnaround time, how quickly they could get an aircraft back into rotation. Caleb had been in the industry long enough to know exactly what that meant. Speed was not compatible with thoroughness. Not in this business. He'd raised the concern directly with Victor during a staff meeting 8 months ago. The memory of it still sat in his chest like a stone. The new metrics don't account for the time required to properly document findings, he'd said. If we're being evaluated on how fast we turn planes around, we're being given an incentive to skip steps. Victor had smiled at him across the conference table, the smile of a man who had already decided what the answer was going to be. Caleb, I appreciate your input, but the data shows we can maintain our safety standards while improving efficiency. The two aren't mutually exclusive. They are when the efficiency targets are set at levels that don't leave room for anything unexpected. The room had gone quiet. 6 other people around that table, none of them saying anything. I'll take that under advisement, Victor had said, and moved on to the next agenda item. That had been 8 months ago. Since then, Caleb had submitted 14 formal maintenance reports. He knew, because he kept copies of everything. He knew that 7 of them had been responded to with either a partial acknowledgement or a directive to use a cheaper repair approach. He knew that 4 of them appeared to have simply disappeared from the system. He kept working anyway. At 7:45 that morning, Claire Whitmore arrived at the executive floor in a charcoal blazer and heels that she always wore when she had an important meeting, which told the administrative staff what they needed to know about the day. She went to her office, pulled up her email, and began reviewing the briefing document her assistant had prepared for the 9 o'clock arrival of Marcus Vail and his acquisition team. Marcus Vail was, depending on who you asked, either the most important investor in regional aviation or the most dangerous. He'd built a reputation acquiring distressed airline assets, restructuring them aggressively, and flipping them at a profit within 3 years. He'd done it 4 times. His team was meticulous, his due diligence thorough, and his interest in Whitmore Aviation represented, in Claire's understanding, the most realistic path forward for a company that had been bleeding cash for 2 years. The deal on the table was straightforward, on its surface. Vail's group would inject $42 million in exchange for a significant equity stake and a seat on the board. The condition was a clean inspection of the fleet. All 22 aircraft, certified airworthy, no outstanding material safety concerns. Victor had assured her personally, 3 days ago, that the fleet would pass. She'd believed him. At 8:03, her desk phone rang. It was the hangar supervisor, a man named Pete Grillo, who had worked for the company since Gerald Whitmore's time, and who Claire had always found slightly difficult to manage because he had a tendency to deliver information without any diplomatic softening whatsoever. "We've got a situation," Pete said. Claire closed her laptop. "What kind of situation?" "Caleb Mercer is refusing to sign off on the Bombardier CRJ and Base 7. He says the landing gear's not right. He wants a full structural review before that aircraft goes anywhere." Claire felt a slow pressure begin building somewhere behind her left eye. "Pete, the Vail team is here in less than 2 hours." "I know when they're here." "Can someone else sign off on it?" A pause. "Technically, yes. But it's Caleb's ticket." "Then have someone else do it." Another pause, longer this time. "Claire, I've known Caleb Mercer for 6 years. If he's refusing to sign off on something..." "Pete." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I need every aircraft in that hangar to be cleared for inspection by 9 o'clock. Can you make that happen or not?" The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that meant Pete was deciding whether to push back or let it go. He let it go. "I'll handle it," he said, and hung up. She didn't go to the hangar herself. That was the thing she would think about later, in the long, uncomfortable silence of hindsight. She didn't go. She made a phone call and delegated the problem, and then went back to reviewing her briefing document. At 8:26, Victor Langley appeared in her office doorway. "There might be a small personnel issue this morning," he said, the way he always said things, calmly, deliberately, as if delivering news that was already resolved. "The mechanic. I know. He's threatening to file an external report to the FAA." Claire looked up. "Is he serious?" "He's been difficult for months, Claire. This is the same person who's filed," he checked something on his phone, "14 internal complaints in 8 months. Every time we hit a deadline, there's some documentation issue, some concern that needs another review. I've been patient with him, but today of all days? What are you recommending?" Victor spread his hands slightly, a gesture of reluctant reasonableness. "I think we let him go, with a severance package, today, before the Vail team arrives." She should have asked more questions. She knew that. There were questions she should have asked. What specifically was the concern about the landing gear? How long had it been flagged? What did the previous report say? But the clock was moving and the Vail meeting was 2 hours away, and she'd been awake since 5:30 running numbers in her head. "Do it," she said. Caleb was in the middle of his 4th notation on the legal pad when Victor Langley walked into the hangar at 8:31 with HR Director Sandra Cho 2 steps behind him, and the particular expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. Caleb looked up from the floor. He took one look at the 2 of them and the legal pad, and something in his face went very still. He stood up slowly, set the flashlight on the workbench. "Caleb," Victor said, "we need to talk." "I figured. Given the ongoing nature of—" "You don't need to walk me through it," Caleb said. His voice was level. Not angry, not hurt, just flat in the way of someone who is choosing carefully how much of themselves to show. "I know what this is." Sandra Cho cleared her throat. "We do want to offer—" "I'll get my stuff," Caleb said. He went to his locker at the back of the hangar and took out a jacket, a set of personal tools in a worn canvas roll, and a photograph that had been taped to the inside of the locker door. His daughter, maybe 8 years old in the picture, sitting on the nose wheel of a small Cessna and laughing at whoever was taking the photo. He put the photograph in his breast pocket. Danny Okafor was standing 20 feet away, watching all of this with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "Caleb," Danny started. "Do your job," Caleb said quietly. "Just do your job carefully. Okay?" Danny nodded, though he didn't look like he trusted himself to say anything else. Caleb picked up the cardboard box that Sandra Cho had produced from somewhere, she'd clearly thought to bring one, and walked toward the hangar's side exit. He didn't go through the main doors. He didn't look at Victor Langley again. At the side exit, he stopped, just for a second. He stood there with one hand on the door and the cardboard box tucked under his other arm, looking back at the 22 aircraft arranged in their bays under the fluorescent light, each one enormous and mechanical and, to most people, indifferent. He'd worked on every single one of them. Then he pushed the door open and walked out into the morning air, and the door swung closed behind him. The Marcus Vail inspection team arrived at 9:05 in a convoy of 3 black SUVs. Vail himself was 54, compact, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of watching rooms rather than performing for them. He shook Claire's hand, made small talk for approximately 90 seconds, and then asked to go directly to the hangar. His lead auditor was a woman named Renata Solis, who had the manner of someone who had been lied to professionally enough times that she'd stopped anticipating honesty and simply built her process around the assumption that she'd need to find it herself. The inspection was supposed to take 3 hours. At the 90-minute mark, Renata Solis found the first inconsistency. A maintenance log entry that referenced a repair completed in March, cross-referenced against a parts invoice that showed the parts hadn't been ordered until May. She flagged it, kept moving. By the 2-hour mark, she'd found 4 more, each one small on its own. Together, they described a pattern. She found Caleb's reports, not the ones filed through the official system, but a separate set. Printed copies, organized by aircraft tail number, stored in a plain manila folder inside a locked cabinet in the secondary tool room that, according to the key registry, was assigned to maintenance staff only. She read through them standing in the tool room, and then she read through them again. Then she walked out to where Marcus Vale and Claire Whitmore were standing near the main hangar doors and said, "I need everyone to stop what they're doing." Shut. The hangar went quiet in the strange, specific way that large spaces go quiet when something has shifted. Technicians stopped moving. The whir of a power tool in Bay 14 cut off mid-rotation. Claire looked at Renata Solis and then at the folder in her hands. "These are maintenance records," Renata said. She wasn't accusing. She was stating. Detailed records covering every aircraft in this hangar. They describe repair work, significant repair work, that was completed but not entered into the official system. They also describe safety concerns that were flagged internally and not acted on. Claire felt the air in the room change. "Every aircraft?" she said. "Every aircraft." The question that was forming in Claire's mind was the obvious one, the only one. She looked at Pete Grillo, who was standing near Bay 7 with his arms at his sides and an expression she couldn't read. "Who did this work?" she asked. "Who maintained these records?" The hangar was silent. Pete Grillo looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at her, and when he spoke, there was something in his voice that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "The man you fired this morning," he said. The silence that followed Pete Grillo's words lasted maybe 4 seconds. In a hangar that size, 4 seconds of silence is a long time, long enough for Claire to feel it physically, a kind of pressure in her chest, like the atmosphere had shifted. "Say that again," she said. Pete didn't say it again. He didn't need to. The folder in Renata Solis's hands was already saying it, page by page, in handwriting that Claire had never seen before, but that she somehow already understood represented an enormous amount of time and effort, and a specific kind of stubbornness that she had, this morning, decided to eliminate. Marcus Vale hadn't moved from where he was standing. He was watching Claire with an expression that was carefully neutral, which she would think about later. At the time, she read it as patience. It wasn't patience. Renata set the folder on the hood of a maintenance cart and spread several pages out flat. "I want to be clear about what I'm looking at," she said, mostly to herself, but loud enough that the small group around her could hear. "These records, whoever kept them, they're organized by tail number, by date, by system. Every entry has a corresponding entry in the official log, or it has a note explaining why there isn't one." She turned a page. "Some of these repairs aren't in the official system at all, which means they were done. The physical work was done, the parts were sourced, but the paperwork was either never submitted or it was submitted and removed." "Removed," Claire repeated. "I can't tell you which, not standing here. That'll take time." Renata looked up. "But the work itself? The actual maintenance? From what I can see, it's thorough. It's correct. In some cases, it's well beyond what the minimum standard would require." Pete Grillo made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's Caleb." Claire turned to look at him. "You knew about this?" "I knew he worked late. I knew he kept his own records because he didn't trust the system." Pete crossed his arms. "I didn't know the full scope. Not until right now, standing here." He paused. "But I'm not surprised." That last part landed somewhere uncomfortable. Claire felt it, though she didn't show it. The implication wasn't subtle. Pete wasn't surprised because Caleb Mercer was the kind of person whose competence was so consistent and so self-evident that the only people who hadn't noticed were the ones who hadn't been paying attention. She turned to Sandra Cho, who was standing slightly apart from the group with the expression of someone who was very aware that whatever happened next was going to generate paperwork. "Where is he now?" "He left the premises approximately, Sandra checked her watch. "An hour and 40 minutes ago. Get him on the phone." "Claire," Victor said from behind her. She'd almost forgotten he was there. "Let's not overreact to—" "Victor." She didn't turn around. "I'm not talking to you right now." The phone call went to voicemail twice. On the third try, it rang 5 times, and then Caleb picked up. He didn't say hello. He just picked up and waited. Claire was in the glass-walled office at the end of the hangar. She'd sent everyone else out. Through the glass, she could see Renata Solis still working through the folder, and Danny Okafor watching from across the hangar with the rigid posture of someone trying to look like he wasn't watching. "Caleb," she said, "it's Claire Whitmore." A pause. "I know who it is. I need you to come back." Another pause, longer. She heard something in the background, wind or traffic. He was outside somewhere. "For what?" he said. "The audit team found your records, the separate set, in the tool room." Silence. "I need you to walk us through them," Claire said. "The auditors need context. Some of the entries reference repairs that aren't in the official system," Caleb said. Not a question. "Yes." She heard him exhale. Not a sigh exactly, more like a controlled release of something he'd been holding for a while. "I can come back and talk to your auditors," he said. "But I'm not coming back to work. Not today, not without understanding what happened to the reports I submitted through the proper channels." "That's fair," Claire said, and she meant it, which surprised her slightly. "Can you be here in an hour?" 45 minutes, he said, and hung up. While they waited, Renata Solis kept working, and what she found in the next 40 minutes began to sketch the outline of something that was larger and more deliberate than Claire had initially understood. The official maintenance logs, the ones submitted through Victor Langley's restructured reporting system, were not fabricated in any obvious way. They weren't crude forgeries. They were something more insidious. They were real records, selectively curated. Completed maintenance entries were present. Certain categories of concern, so landing gear anomalies, hydraulic system flags, avionics discrepancies above a specific threshold, had a pattern of being logged and then either closed without documented resolution or reclassified as monitored, no action required, within 48 hours of submission. Renata pulled up a specific entry on her laptop and turned the screen toward her assistant. "Look at this one. Hydraulic pressure irregularity, tail number N8834 flagged in February. 2 days later, status changed to resolved, but there's no repair order, no parts, no technician signature on a resolution report." Her assistant leaned in. "So it just closed itself?" "In the system, yes." Renata looked at the folder. In Caleb Mercer's records, the same aircraft has a notation from February. Hydraulic actuator replaced, sourced from their parts inventory, work performed over 3 nights. He signed it himself. "It's not in the official system because—" She stopped. "Because if it was submitted through the official channel, it would have been reclassified again," her assistant finished. "That's my guess." She kept that guess to herself when Marcus Vale came into the room and asked for an update. She gave him the factual version, entries present, some discrepancies, continuing to review, and watched his face for something. She'd been doing this long enough to watch faces. His face gave her very little, which was itself a kind of information. Caleb arrived at 43 minutes, which meant he'd been closer than he'd let on. He came through the main entrance in the same clothes he'd left in, jeans, a gray thermal, work boots, and he still had the cardboard box, though he'd left it in his truck. He walked into the hangar and stopped, and for a moment he just stood there looking at the planes the way someone looks at something they've spent a lot of time with and aren't sure they'll see again. Danny Okafor crossed the hangar in about 10 steps. "Man." "I'm just here to talk," Caleb said. He said it without heat, but clearly. Danny stopped, nodded, stepped back. Renata Solis met Caleb at the entrance to the glass office and introduced herself without ceremony. "I'm the lead auditor. I've been going through your records for the last hour and a half." "Okay," Caleb said. "I have questions." "I have answers," he said. "Whether you like them is a different thing." She almost smiled. "Fair. Come in." Claire was already inside. She was sitting at the desk that was normally Victor Langley's. She'd chosen it deliberately, though she hadn't examined why, and she stood when Caleb came in. They looked at each other for a moment with the particular awkwardness of two people who have had a professional relationship complicated by a morning's worth of events. "Thank you for coming back," Claire said. Caleb nodded once. He didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't exactly fine. And he wasn't the kind of person who said things that weren't true to smooth over discomfort. He sat down across from Renata and spent the next hour and 20 minutes going through the folder with her, page by page, entry by entry. He spoke without defensiveness and without performance. He explained what he'd found on each aircraft, why he'd chosen to document it separately, and what had happened when he'd submitted the concerns through official channels. Renata asked precise questions. Caleb gave precise answers. Claire sat to the side and listened and said almost nothing because she was doing something she had apparently not been doing enough of lately, which was learning things. At one point, Renata put down the page she was holding and looked at Caleb directly. Some of these repairs, you sourced the parts yourself, on your own authorization. My certification level covers it. That's not what I'm asking. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The official parts requisition process was routed through operations, Victor Langley's office. After the third time a parts order I submitted got delayed past a reasonable window, I started going directly to approved vendors and documenting the purchase separately. He paused. I paid for 2 of them out of pocket. The room was quiet. Out of your own pocket, Renata said. Small components. Under $400 total. He said it without drama. I submitted expense reports. They were denied. Claire looked at the table. She looked at it for a long time. Well, the picture that emerged over the course of that hour was not the picture of a disgruntled employee who couldn't follow process. It was the picture of someone who had watched the process systematically fail and had made a decision, privately, without seeking credit or acknowledgement, to do the work anyway. For 8 months, while the official maintenance reporting system was quietly filtering out concerns above a certain cost threshold, Caleb Mercer had been working nights and early mornings. Not all of them. He had a daughter, a small apartment 20 minutes from the airport, a life that existed outside these walls. But enough nights, enough mornings. He had gone through every aircraft in the fleet with a methodical attention that the official maintenance cycle, under Victor's restructured timeline, no longer allowed for. He hadn't told anyone the full scope of it. Not Pete Grillo, not Danny, not anyone. Partly because telling someone would have meant explaining what he'd found, which would have meant explaining what he believed was being done with the reports he submitted, which would have meant making an accusation he couldn't yet prove. Partly because he'd learned over 14 years in this industry that the people who were loudest about safety concerns were the ones who got managed out first. So he'd been quiet. He'd kept his head down and done the work, and kept copies of everything and waited for something to force the question into the open. He hadn't anticipated that the something would be Marcus Vale. He hadn't anticipated a lot of things about this morning. One question, Renata said near the end. The CRJ in Base 7, the nose gear, that's the one you refused to sign off on this morning. Yes. Walk me through it. Caleb pulled a specific page from the folder. He knew exactly where it was without searching. Vibration anomaly in the nose gear assembly. First noted 6 weeks ago. I flagged it. It was closed in the system as within tolerance. I ran my own measurements. It's not within tolerance under the load conditions we'd see on a wet runway at landing speeds above 130 knots. He set the page on the table. It wouldn't fail every time. Maybe not for a year, but when it failed, it would fail fast and it would fail at the worst possible moment. Renata looked at the page. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'm going to need a structural engineer to look at this one specifically, she said. I know, Caleb said. That's why I wouldn't sign off on it. Oh, Victor Langley had been trying to get into the glass office for the past 40 minutes. Sandra Cho had been running interference, which she was doing with a tight professionalism that suggested she'd already begun recalibrating her read of which way the wind was blowing in this building. When Renata finally opened the office door, Victor was waiting with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged into an expression of concerned reasonableness. I'd like to be part of this conversation, he said. As operations director, these records fall under my... Mr. Langley, Renata said, I'm going to need access to your internal email records from the past 14 months. All correspondence related to maintenance reporting, budget approvals, and parts requisitions. Victor's face didn't change, exactly, but something behind his eyes moved, a very small and very quick recalculation. I'll have to check with our legal. That's your right, Renata said pleasantly. I'll note the delay in my report. She paused. We'll also be requesting the server logs for your reporting system to see the full edit history on maintenance status entries. Victor looked past her at Caleb, who was still sitting at the table. Their eyes met. Caleb held his gaze without expression. I'm trying to understand what's happening here, Victor said, addressing the room rather than any one person. Caleb Mercer is an employee who was let go this morning for insubordination. He had a documented pattern of— Victor, Claire said. He stopped. She was standing now next to the desk, and her voice had something in it that hadn't been there this morning when she'd told Pete Grillo to handle the problem. Something that came from sitting in a room for an hour and a half and listening to a man describe work he'd done in the dark when nobody was watching, for no recognition and occasionally at his own expense. Stop talking, she said. The way she said it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Victor closed his mouth. He looked at her for a moment, and for the first time in the 18 months she'd known him, the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had already decided what the answer was going to be. Marcus Vale had been standing outside the hangar entrance for the last 20 minutes, on a phone call that he'd stepped away to make privately. Danny Okafor, who happened to be doing something near the exterior door, couldn't hear the call. He could see Vale's face through the glass panel beside the door, though. He mentioned this to Pete Grillo later. What did he look like? Pete asked. Danny thought about it. Like someone doing math? Pete nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something. Marcus Vale came back inside and asked to speak with Claire privately, and she told him, with a politeness that was cooler than any tone she'd taken with him all morning, that she needed another hour before she could have that conversation. Vale accepted this without visible reaction. Renata Solis, watching from across the hangar, made a small note on her legal pad. Dimmed. By 4 in the afternoon, the inspection that was supposed to take 3 hours had been running for 7, and the picture it was painting had gotten clearer and darker and more complicated with every hour that passed. The Vale team was still on site. The airline's legal counsel had arrived and was in a conference room upstairs trying to understand the scope of what he was looking at. Caleb was still there too, which surprised him. He'd thought he'd come in, answer some questions, and leave. Instead, he'd been sitting in the glass office or standing in the hangar answering questions for auditors who kept finding another thing they needed to understand. At 4:15, Danny brought him a cup of coffee without being asked. Bad coffee, from the machine in the break room, in a paper cup that was already going soft on one side. Caleb took it. Thanks. Danny stood there for a moment. Are you coming back? Caleb looked at him. I don't know yet. The CRJ in Bay 7, Danny said. I went back and looked at it after you left this morning. The nose gear. I ran the measurements you had in your notes. He stopped. You were right. Caleb nodded. I should have said something this morning, Danny said. When they walked you out, I should have— You're 26 years old, Caleb said. You've got a job and a lease and probably a car payment. You don't owe me anything. That's not— Danny started, then stopped. He looked frustrated with himself in the specific way of someone who knows the right thing and has to live with not having done it. It's not about owing you. Caleb drank the coffee, which was bad in the particular way that break room coffee was always bad, and looked out at the hangar floor. Then do better next time, he said. That's all any of us can do. Danny nodded. He went back to work. There was still work to be done, and the planes were still there, and whatever else was happening in offices above their heads, the aircraft didn't care about any of it. That was the thing about planes, Caleb had always thought. They were entirely indifferent to human politics. You either maintained them correctly or you didn't, and the consequences of the latter were not negotiable and did not arrive with warnings. He set the paper cup on the workbench and looked at the Bombardier in Bay 7, enormous and silver gray under the hangar lights, sitting exactly where it had been when he'd crawled out from under it at 6 this morning. Still grounded. Still waiting. He'd been right about the nose gear. He'd been right about all of it. That wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was something quieter and harder to name. The particular exhausting feeling of having been right about the wrong things for a very long time. The meeting with Marcus Vale happened at 5:17 in the afternoon, in the small conference room on the second floor that Claire's father had used for pilot briefings back when the company was young enough that he knew every pilot by name. The room still had the same table, oval, dark wood, scuffed along one edge where someone had dragged a chair across it years ago and nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it. Claire had always meant to replace it. She hadn't. She sat on one side with her legal counsel, a man named Robert Fitch, who had been with the company for 11 years and who had spent the last 2 hours in a state of controlled alarm that he was managing through very careful note-taking. Renata Solis was there too, at Claire's request, because Claire had decided approximately an hour ago that Renata was the most trustworthy person in the building and she wanted her in the room. Marcus Vale sat across from them with his own attorney and a younger associate who hadn't introduced himself and whose job appeared to be managing the laptop that Vale periodically glanced at. They had been talking for 11 minutes, and it was already clear that they were not having the same conversation. Vale was calm, measured. He expressed concern about the findings from the audit, the right amount of concern, Claire thought, calibrated carefully. He suggested that the discrepancies in the maintenance logs represented a management problem that his team could help resolve. He used the phrase operational reset twice. He talked about the value his group could bring to a company in transition. Claire listened to all of it. She let him finish. Then she said, "Marcus, I'd like to talk about the timeline." He tilted his head slightly. "The timeline? Your team approached us 14 months ago. Initial contact, lowball offer, we declined. Then 8 months ago, you came back with a restructured proposal, and around that same time, Victor Langley joined our company." She kept her voice even. "Victor came to us with a referral from a consulting group that, as of this morning, our legal team has identified as having a financial relationship with one of your holding companies." The room was very quiet. Vale's attorney leaned in slightly toward his client. Vale didn't look at him. "That's an interesting framing," Vale said. "I'm not trying to frame anything," Claire said. "I'm trying to understand what I'm looking at. Because what I'm looking at is a maintenance reporting system that was restructured 8 months ago in a way that systematically buried safety concerns and made our fleet look worse than it was on paper. And a separate set of records showing that the actual physical condition of our aircraft is significantly better than what your acquisition model would reflect." She paused. "So I'm wondering what your offer would look like if your model was based on the real numbers." Vale was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the calibration in his voice had shifted slightly, still controlled, but with something underneath it now. "Claire, I think you're drawing connections that Victor Langley is going to cooperate with the audit," she said. "He told me that himself about an hour ago." That last part wasn't entirely true. Victor had said something in the vicinity of cooperation while looking like a man considering his options very rapidly, but it was close enough. When the server logs come back showing the full edit history on every maintenance status entry, I'm going to have a very complete picture of what happened in this building over the last 8 months, and then I'm going to have a conversation with the FAA. She let that land. "I wanted to have this conversation with you first." Vale looked at her across the dark wood table for a long moment. Then he looked at the scuff mark on the edge of the table, and then back at her. "You're canceling the agreement," he said. "I'm canceling the agreement." He nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they've assessed a situation and accepted the outcome without conceding anything more than the minimum. He said something to his attorney in a tone too low for Claire to hear. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at Claire with an expression that was entirely unreadable. "Your father was a difficult man to do business with, too," he said. Claire held his gaze. "I'll take that." Vale's convoy left the parking lot at 5:51. Claire watched it from the window of her father's old briefing room, and she kept watching until the last SUV turned out of the lot and disappeared. Then she sat down in the nearest chair, which happened to be the one with the torn armrest that she'd also always meant to replace, and she sat there for a while, not doing anything in particular. Robert Fitch was still at the table, making notes. After a few minutes, he said without looking up, "That went better than I expected." "It went terribly," Claire said. "Right, but, relatively." She didn't answer. She was looking at the ceiling, which needed repainting in the corner above the door. She'd noticed that before and never done anything about it either. She seemed to have a long history of noticing things and not doing anything about them. "I need you to pull together everything on Langley," she said. "Every contract, every authorization, every communication routed through his office. I want it documented before he has time to talk to his own attorney." "Already started," Fitch said. She looked at him. "Thank you." "I've been waiting 18 months to start it," he said, and there was nothing in his voice except the flat truth of it. Chub. Caleb was still in the hangar when Claire came downstairs at 6:30. The inspection team had packed up and left. Danny had gone home an hour ago after Claire's assistant came down and told the remaining maintenance staff they could leave. But Caleb was still there, standing near Bay 7 with his arms crossed, looking at the Bombardier. He wasn't doing anything. He was just looking at it. Claire walked across the hangar floor, which felt very large and very quiet with the inspection team gone and the fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights always did in the early evening, making everything look slightly more exhausted than it actually was. She stopped a few feet from him. He heard her coming but didn't turn until she was almost beside him. Then he looked at her with the same level, non-committal expression he'd had for most of the day. "Vale's gone," she said. "I heard. The deal is canceled." He nodded. He already knew that too, or had guessed it. Claire looked at the aircraft in front of them. The nose gear was still marked with a yellow caution flag, a physical marker Caleb had placed himself that morning, the last thing he'd done before Victor Langley walked across the hangar floor with Sandra Cho behind him. "I owe you an apology," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to. I'm not doing it because I have to." She stopped. "I fired you because Victor told me you were a problem, and I was too busy and too scared this morning to ask the right questions. I should have asked them." She paused again. "I should have been asking them for months." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He looked at the floor, then back at the plane, and Claire had the impression of someone choosing not to say several things before settling on the one that was true without being unkind. "You inherited a company in trouble," he said, "and somebody handed you a version of what was wrong with it that was convenient for them. That happens." He glanced at her. "Doesn't mean the question still shouldn't have been asked." "No," she said, "it doesn't." They stood there for a moment, both looking at the Bombardier, which was indifferent to all of it. "I want you to come back," Claire said. "Formally. Full reinstatement, back pay for today. And I want to talk to you about what a real maintenance oversight role would look like. Not what Victor designed, something actually functional." Caleb turned and looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. His expression wasn't what she expected. It wasn't relief or satisfaction or any of the things that the moment seemed to be set up to produce. It was something more cautious than that. "I appreciate that," he said, "but I need you to understand something before I give you an answer." "Okay. I've been in this industry for 14 years. I've seen good companies go bad, and I've seen bad companies stay bad because the people at the top made the right noises after a crisis and then went back to doing what was comfortable." He said it without accusation, but without softening either. "I'm not interested in coming back to a version of this company that changes the names on the org chart and keeps the same structure." Claire nodded slowly. "What would you need to see?" "I'd need the reporting chain to be independent of operations. Maintenance concerns go to you directly, or they go to an external safety officer who reports to the board, not through whoever's running day-to-day operations." He paused. "I'd need it to be policy, written, board-approved, that no employee can be terminated for filing a safety report, with teeth, not just a sentence in an employee handbook." "That's reasonable," Claire said. "And I'd need the maintenance budget to be set by engineering review, not by operations efficiency targets." He stopped. "Those are the basics. There's more, but that's where I'd start." Claire was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about what it would take to implement each of those things, and what it would mean for the way the company had been structured, and how much of that structure she'd accepted without question because Victor Langley had presented it to her as progress. "I can do that," she said. "I believe you mean it right now," Caleb said. "I'm less certain about 6 months from now, when things are stable and there's pressure on the budget again." That was a fair thing to say. She knew it was fair, which was why it was uncomfortable. "Then hold me to it," she said. "That's all I can offer you. I can tell you what I intend to do, and you can decide if you trust it enough to come back, and if I don't follow through, you leave, and this time I deserve it." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The hangar was very quiet. Outside, through the high windows near the roofline, the sky had gone the particular blue-gray of early evening. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no either, and Claire had the sense that from Caleb Mercer, that was as much as honesty allowed for right now. Victor Langley came to Claire's office at 7:45 that evening, which surprised her because she'd expected him to lawyer up and go silent. Instead, he appeared in her doorway in the same suit he'd been wearing all day, which now looked like what it was, a suit that a man had been wearing for 12 hours while the ground shifted under him. He asked if he could sit down. She didn't tell him yes or no, which he took as permission. I want to explain, he said. I'm listening, Claire said, though her tone made it clear she was listening the way you listen when you've already arrived at a destination and someone wants to tell you about the road. The Vale opportunity was real, he said. The acquisition, the capital. It was genuinely what the company needed. I believe that. And the maintenance reports? Victor looked at his hands. He had the look of a man who had spent several hours constructing a version of events that was defensible, and was now in the room where he had to actually say it out loud to the person it had been done to, which was a different experience. Some of the concerns Caleb flagged were legitimate, he said. I knew that. Some, Claire repeated. Most, he said after a pause. Most of them were legitimate. And you buried them because they would have shown up in the audit and reduced what Vale was willing to pay. Victor was quiet. Victor. Yes, he said. Yes. The word sat in the room. The plan, he said, trying again, was that Vale's capital would come in and we'd do the real repairs properly with resources we didn't currently have. I wasn't trying to put anyone in danger. The aircraft were still being maintained. By Caleb, Claire said, working at 4 a.m. on his own time, paying out of pocket for parts that your office denied. Victor had nothing to say to that. Whatever version of the story he'd spent the afternoon constructing didn't have a good response to that particular fact. He knew, Victor said finally. Caleb knew what I was doing. He figured it out around month 3. That's why I started managing him the way I did. If he'd gone to the FAA, we'd have been better off, Claire said. Victor looked at her. If he'd filed an external report 8 months ago, we'd have had to deal with the real problems, she said. Instead, you spent 8 months managing him out the door while he fixed the planes at 4 a.m, and we ended up in a room with an acquisition team that was using our own falsified problems to steal the company. She stood up. Get your things from your office. Don't access any systems. Robert Fitch will contact you tomorrow about the formal process. Victor stood. He looked like he wanted to say something else, some final accounting, some mitigation. He didn't. He walked out, and Claire listened to his footsteps go down the hall and stop at his office, and then start again, and then go toward the elevator. When she heard the elevator doors open and close, she sat back down. Renata Solis stopped by at 8:15 on her way out. She had her coat on and her laptop bag over one shoulder and the manila folder under her arm. She hadn't let it out of her possession all day. The structural engineer I'm bringing in for the nose gear, he can be here Thursday, she said. I'll make sure the aircraft stays grounded, Claire said. Renata nodded. She started to go, then stopped. The records Mercer kept, the documentation, the cross-referencing, the way he organized it by tail number and date and system. She paused. I've done a lot of these audits. I've seen maintenance records that cost companies millions of dollars to produce. His were better. I know, Claire said. He did that alone, over 8 months, while being actively managed out of his own job. Renata looked at her steadily. I just wanted to make sure you understood the full dimension of what that is. I'm starting to, Claire said. Renata left. Claire sat alone in her office, and the building around her was quiet in the way buildings are quiet at night. Not empty exactly, but reduced to its essential sounds. The hum of the HVAC, a phone ringing unanswered somewhere down the hall, the occasional distant sound of an aircraft on final approach to the main runway 2 miles away. She thought about her father. She thought about what he'd said to her once when she was maybe 17 and had come to the hangar on a weekend and found him talking to a mechanic about something she didn't understand. Both of them crouched under the nose of a small regional turboprop with flashlights. She'd asked him later what they'd been talking about. "He found something I wouldn't have found," her father had said. "I was asking him to explain it." She'd thought that was just her father being her father. The endless patience for the details of aircraft, the way he talked to the maintenance crew, the same way he talked to board members. Now, sitting in her office at the end of the longest day she'd had since taking over the company, she understood that it hadn't been patience. It had been something more specific than that. It had been the understanding that the people who actually put their hands on the aircraft were the ones who knew what the aircraft were doing, and that no amount of management structure or efficiency metrics or investor presentations changed that fundamental fact. Her father had known it intuitively. She'd had to learn it the hard way, through a crisis she'd partly caused and almost failed to survive. She picked up her phone and looked at Caleb's number. She didn't call. He'd said he needed to think about it, and she owed him the space to do that without her feeling it. She put the phone down and opened her laptop and started drafting a memo to the board. And the first line she wrote was not about the canceled acquisition or the operational restructuring or the regulatory implications of what had been found in the maintenance logs. The first line was about a mechanic who had come to work at 4 in the morning and done the right thing in the dark for 8 months, while the company around him moved in the wrong direction, and what that said about everything that needed to change. She sat there writing for a long time, and outside, somewhere on the flight line, a ground crew was prepping an aircraft for an early departure, and the sound of it, engines cycling, radio chatter, the particular mechanical percussion of a plane getting ready to move, came through the window faint and familiar. The sound the building had always made at night when her father was alive, and she used to fall asleep to it on the couch in his office when she was small. She kept writing. Caleb called at 7:20 the next morning. Claire was already at her desk, which shouldn't have surprised her, but did slightly because she'd gone home at midnight and been back by 6:15 and had not slept particularly well in between. She'd lain in her apartment staring at the ceiling thinking about nose gear assemblies and server logs, and a photograph of a little girl sitting on a Cessna wheel, laughing. She picked up on the second ring. "I'll come back," Caleb said. No preamble. "Under the conditions we talked about." Claire exhaled slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I want the policy language in writing before I sign anything, and I want to review the maintenance budget methodology before the next operational cycle. I'll have Robert Fitch send you draft language by end of day." A pause. "Okay." "Caleb." She stopped herself, then continued. "I want to be honest with you. The company is in a difficult position financially. Canceling the Vail deal means we don't have the capital injection we were counting on. I'm going to be making hard decisions about structure and costs over the next few months, and some of those decisions are going to be uncomfortable." "I know that," he said. "I just want you to walk in with clear eyes." "I've had clear eyes this whole time," he said, and it wasn't unkind, just accurate, and she accepted it as such. He said he'd be in by 9. He was there at 8:40. What? The board meeting happened 2 days later, on a Thursday, in the larger conference room that had a window overlooking the east end of the tarmac. 7 board members, 3 of whom had been appointed during Gerald Whitmore's tenure, and 4 of whom had come in during the last 2 years under recommendations that Claire was now looking at differently, had all passed through Victor Langley's network at some point. She presented everything, all of it. The audit findings, Caleb's records, the pattern of buried reports, the connection between Victor and the consulting group tied to Vail's holdings, the conversation with Vail himself. She put it on the table without softening and without the kind of framing that was designed to protect the person delivering the news, rather than inform the people receiving it. The room was uncomfortable for most of it. Board members who had signed off on Victor's budget restructuring were now sitting with the knowledge of what that restructuring had produced, and that knowledge had a specific weight to it that performance review euphemisms couldn't carry. When she was done presenting, a board member named Harrison Walsh, 62 years old, former commercial pilot, Gerald's oldest friend on the board, said, "How did we not know?" "Because the system was designed so we wouldn't," Claire said. "The reporting chain went through Victor's office. He decided what reached us." She paused. "And we let that happen. I let that happen." Walsh looked at the table. He had the particular discomfort of a man who prided himself on oversight and had just been shown a specific way in which his oversight had failed. "What do you need from us?" he said. Claire presented 3 things: board approval for an independent safety officer position, reporting directly to the board, not to operations, approval to restructure the maintenance budget methodology, and authorization to bring in an external firm to conduct a full regulatory compliance review. The vote was 6-1. The dissenting vote was from a board member named Patricia Dean, who said she was concerned about the cost of the compliance review given the company's current cash position. Claire noted the objection and moved forward. After the meeting, Walsh caught her in the hallway. "Your father would have fired Langley the first month," he said. "I know," Claire said. "He had a nose for people who were solving problems that didn't exist yet in order to create problems later." "I'm working on developing that," she said. Walsh nodded and put on his coat. "You ran that room better than you've run any board meeting I've seen you in. That's something." It was something. She took it. The structural engineer Renata had recommended arrived Thursday afternoon. A compact woman named Dr. Iris Tran, who brought 2 assistants and a diagnostic kit that took 20 minutes to unpack, and who went directly to the Bombardier in Bay 7 without stopping to make small talk with anyone. Caleb met her at the aircraft. They introduced themselves, shook hands, and immediately began talking in the specific shorthand of people who shared a professional language dense enough that everyone else in earshot could follow about 40% of it. Danny Okafor was nearby, trying to look busy while actually listening. Dr. Tran ran her evaluation over 3 hours. She brought Caleb in to show her the specific load conditions he'd documented, walked through his measurement methodology, asked pointed questions that Caleb answered without hedging. At the end of 3 hours, she straightened up from where she'd been crouched near the gear assembly and said, "The anomaly is in the shimmy damper. It's degraded. Not catastrophically, but it's past the point where it should have been flagged." "I flagged it 6 weeks ago," Caleb said. "I know, I read your notes." She looked at the aircraft. "Under the conditions you described, wet runway, landing speeds above 130, you'd be looking at potential nose gear oscillation on rollout. In a worst case, loss of directional control." Caleb nodded. He'd known that. Saying it out loud to someone with the credentials to confirm it was a different experience than knowing it alone. "Good catch," Dr. Tran said. She said it simply, without ceremony, the way one professional acknowledges another's work when it was done correctly. "It was in the notes for 6 weeks, Caleb said. "I know," she said again. "That's not a comment on you." She filed her report that afternoon. The shimmy damper was replaced over the following 2 days by Caleb and Danny working together, with every step documented in the new reporting system that Caleb had been helping Claire's operations team build since Tuesday. A system where maintenance concerns logged by any certified technician went simultaneously to the technician's supervisor, to Claire's office, and to the new independent safety log that would be reviewed by the incoming safety officer. It was not a complicated system. That was one of the things Caleb had said when they were designing it, in a meeting with Claire and 2 members of her operations team and Robert Fitch, who took notes on everything. "The previous system wasn't complicated either," Caleb had said. "It was simple in a way that made it easy to route things around. We just need simple in the other direction, transparent instead of funneled." One of the operations team members, a woman named Grace Holloway, who had been with the company 8 years and who had a careful way of speaking that suggested she'd learned to be careful, said, "Some of the flight ops team is going to push back on direct reporting. They're going to say it slows turnaround." "It does slow turnaround," Caleb said, "by the amount of time it takes to document what you're doing. That's appropriate." Grace wrote something down. "I'm just flagging the resistance." "I know," Caleb said. "Document the resistance too." Grace had looked at him for a moment, then written something else down. Victor Langley's formal separation from the company was processed on Friday. He left without incident, which Claire had half expected and half feared wouldn't be the case. He had hired an attorney by Wednesday, and the attorney had communicated through Robert Fitch with the measured language of someone who had assessed the situation and understood that the documentation trail was not favorable to his client. There were discussions about severance. Claire let Fitch handle them. She didn't speak to Victor again directly. She wasn't sure what she would have said. The conversation in her office Tuesday evening had covered the essential territory, and she found that she didn't have the appetite for another one. What she felt about Victor Langley was not straightforward anger. It was something more complicated and less satisfying, a kind of retrospective bewilderment at how thoroughly she had trusted someone who had been, from the beginning, operating on a different set of priorities than the ones she'd thought she was sharing with him. She thought about that a lot in the days following, about what she'd wanted to believe and how that wanting had made her susceptible to a version of the story that was convenient. Victor hadn't lied to her about everything. The company did have financial problems. The Vale Capital would have helped in the short term. The maintenance operation did have inefficiencies that needed addressing. He'd taken real problems and real solutions and quietly bent them to serve an additional purpose that she'd never been told about. That was harder to process than a simple deception. It required her to look at her own judgment without the comfort of being able to say she'd been obviously fooled. She'd been fooled in a sophisticated way by someone who understood which parts of the truth to use. The FAA notification went out on the same Friday. Robert Fitch and the compliance firm Claire had engaged drafted it together. A voluntary disclosure of the maintenance reporting anomalies with full documentation, including Caleb's records and Renata Solis's audit findings. Voluntary disclosure carried different weight with regulators than a complaint-triggered investigation, and the compliance firm had been clear that getting ahead of it was the only viable path. The FAA assigned an investigator the following Monday. His name was Gerald Park, and he arrived on Tuesday with a junior colleague and a look that suggested he had done many of these and had calibrated expectations accordingly. He spent 2 days reviewing records, interviewing staff, and walking the hangar floor with Caleb as a guide. On the second day, at the end of the afternoon, Park found Caleb in the hangar doing a routine inspection on one of the 737s. "You kept good records," Park said. "I kept records," Caleb said. "I don't know if they're good. They're what I had." "They're good," Park said. "Thorough, organized, dated. You know how often we come into a situation like this and the person who actually knew what was happening kept nothing, no paper trail, no copies, nothing they can show us? I've been in this industry long enough to know that the paper is the only thing that survives," Caleb said. Park looked at him for a moment. "What made you think to keep the separate set?" "From the beginning." Caleb thought about it. "The first time a report I submitted got closed without documentation of a resolution, I made a copy. It felt like something I should have in my own files." He shrugged slightly. "It became a habit that probably saved this company from a significant regulatory action," Park said. "Possibly more than that." Caleb didn't respond to that. He went back to the inspection checklist in his hand. Park watched him for a moment and then moved on. Claire came down to the hangar on Wednesday afternoon, not for a meeting, not for a scheduled walkthrough, just to be in it. This was something she'd started doing that week, in a way she hadn't done before. Coming down without an agenda, standing in the space, watching what happened. What happened was work. The constant, unglamorous, careful work of keeping aircraft in condition to carry people safely from one place to another. Checklists and tool rolls and reference manuals and conversations between technicians that were largely technical and occasionally personal, and always grounded in the specific reality of what they were looking at. She'd grown up around this and somehow not absorbed it. Or she'd absorbed it and then gradually traded the knowledge of it for a different kind of knowledge. The knowledge of balance sheets and organizational charts and investor relations, which was real and necessary, but which had, at some point, become so primary that she'd stopped understanding what it was in service of. She found Caleb in the secondary tool room, the same one where Renata had found his folder, organizing a set of calibration tools on the workbench. He did this methodically, each tool in a specific place, the kind of organization that was clearly habitual and not performed. "Can I ask you something?" she said from the doorway. He looked up. "Sure." "When did you decide to start keeping the separate records? What was the moment?" He set down the tool he was holding. He thought about it with the same deliberate quality she'd noticed he brought to everything. He didn't answer questions reflexively, he actually considered them. "Second month after Victor restructured the reporting chain," he said. "I submitted a flag on a hydraulic actuator on tail 8834. Week later, it showed up in the system as resolved, no documentation. I went and checked the aircraft. Nothing had been done." He paused. "So I made a copy of the original flag and I did the repair myself, and I wrote it down separately, because I needed to know, at least, that I knew what had actually happened. "You didn't go to Claire?" she said, and then stopped, because she'd referred to herself in the third person, which felt strange. "To me. You didn't come to me." "You were very focused on the veil process," he said. "Not accusatory, just accurate. And Victor was your person. I had no evidence yet, just a closed ticket and a gut feeling. If I went to you with a gut feeling about your operations director, what do you think would have happened?" She knew the answer to that. She thought she would have listened, but she also thought that the version of herself from 8 months ago would have heard concern about Victor and filtered it through the framing Victor had already established. Difficult employee, resistant to change, 14 complaints, documented pattern. "You're probably right," she said. "I know I'm right," he said. Not with satisfaction, just the same flatness of someone for whom being right had never made the situation better, only more documented. Claire leaned against the doorframe. "For what it's worth, that changes. The new structure, maintenance concerns go to me directly. You don't have to wait for evidence to accumulate before you have a path that doesn't go through someone who might have an interest in stopping it." "I know," Caleb said. "That's why I came back." She nodded. She started to go, then stopped. "The photograph in your locker. The little girl on the Cessna." He looked at her. "Your daughter?" "Maya," he said. "She's 11 now. That picture's a few years old. Does she know what you do?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "She knows I fix planes. She thinks it's one of the most boring jobs that exists." He picked up the calibration tool he'd set down. "She wants to be a marine biologist." "Smart kid," Claire said. "Very," he said, and went back to his work. Just say, the weeks that followed were not easy. Claire had been honest about that on the phone the morning Caleb agreed to come back, and the reality of it bore that out. Without the Vail capital, the company was operating on a tighter margin than it had in years. Claire spent significant time with the board and with the company's banking relationships working through options. A smaller, more targeted capital raise from existing investors, a renegotiation of their fleet leasing terms, a careful reduction in administrative overhead that involved some difficult conversations with people who'd been with the company a long time. She did not cut the maintenance budget. She reorganized it, restructured how it was allocated, and in some areas increased it, but she did not cut it. There were people on the board who raised this. She held the line. "The maintenance budget is not a discretionary line," she said in one board meeting to Patricia Dean, who had again raised the cost question. "It is a fixed operational requirement. We can discuss what it costs to run this company correctly, but we're not going to discuss whether to run it correctly." Harrison Walsh made a small sound that might have been approval. Patricia Dean made a note on her pad that was either a counter-argument in preparation or an acceptance. She didn't push further. Caleb wasn't in that meeting. He didn't know it had happened. But Grace Holloway, who had been in the room taking minutes, mentioned it to Pete Grillo the next day, and Pete mentioned it to Danny Okafor, and Danny mentioned it to Caleb while they were both doing a systems check on one of the regional jets. Caleb listened. He didn't say anything for a moment. He said, which was the closest he came to expressing that something had met or exceeded his expectations. Danny interpreted this correctly. "Yeah," he said. They went back to the systems check. The independent safety officer position was posted 3 weeks after the board meeting. Claire had initially assumed Caleb would be the obvious candidate, and she'd been prepared to offer it directly. When she raised it with him, in a conversation in the glass-walled office that now felt different to both of them than it had on the day they'd first used it together, though neither of them said so, he'd shaken his head. "Wrong job for me," he said. "Why?" "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I'm good at it. The safety officer role is oversight and reporting and policy. It's important, but it's a different thing. You need someone who's going to be effective in that function." He paused. "And honestly, I don't want to spend my days in meetings. I want to spend them on the aircraft." She'd studied him for a moment. "You could do both." "I could do one well," he said. "That's what you need." He suggested a name instead, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had spent 12 years as an FAA field inspector before moving into private aviation consulting. He'd worked with her on a compliance review at a previous job. She was thorough, she was independent, and she had a quality that Caleb described without editorializing as, she doesn't care who's uncomfortable with what she finds. Claire contacted Patricia Osei the next day. They spoke for 40 minutes. Claire offered her the position at the end of the call. Patricia Osei said she'd think about it and called back the following morning to accept, which was apparently her standard process, and said nothing about her level of interest, which Claire found out later had been significant from the start. On a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks after the day that had changed everything, Claire walked the hangar floor during the afternoon shift. She did this regularly now, not with an agenda, not with a clipboard, just walking and watching and occasionally stopping to ask questions. She was still learning the answers to most of them. She'd accepted that the learning was going to take longer than she'd initially assumed, and that this was not a problem, but a condition. Pete Grillo fell into step beside her near Bay 11. FAA investigators closing his preliminary review next week, Pete said. Fitch says it's trending toward a corrective action plan rather than enforcement. That's what the compliance team projected, Claire said. Still better than the alternative. Yes. They walked in silence for a moment. Pete had a specific way of walking through the hangar, slowly, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at everything. She'd noticed it before but was only now understanding what it was. He was checking. Continuously, habitually, the way people check things when they've done it for long enough that it stops being a decision and becomes a reflex. Pete, she said, did you know the full scope of what Caleb was doing? The night work, the separate records? Pete was quiet for a few steps. I knew more than I let on when you asked me that on Tuesday, he said. Not all of it, but more. She nodded. She'd thought as much. Why didn't you come to me? He looked at the floor, then up. Same reason Caleb didn't, he said. Victor had your ear and we had our gut feelings and the math didn't look good. He paused. That's not an excuse. I've got 30 years in aviation. I should have pushed harder. You should have, she agreed. So should I have, in a different direction. They stopped at Bay 7. The Bombardier was fully repaired now. Shimmy damper replaced, documentation complete, cleared by Dr. Tran's follow-up inspection, and signed off by Caleb and countersigned for the first time in the company's restructured process, with a direct copy to Claire's office. The yellow caution flag was gone. The aircraft looked like what it was, a regional jet, unremarkable from the outside, which was the whole point. You know what your father used to say? Pete said. Which thing? Pete smiled slightly. The first time she'd seen him smile in weeks. He used to say the most expensive thing in aviation is pretending something isn't wrong. He looked at the aircraft. He said it enough times that I stopped really hearing it, but it turns out it's one of those things that's just true. Claire looked at the plane. At the place where the yellow flag had been, now nothing. Just aircraft, ready to fly. I know, she said. I'm starting to understand what he meant. 3 months is not a long time to change a company. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either selling something or hasn't tried. What 3 months can do, if the people involved are willing to do the uncomfortable work of it, is establish a direction. Make it visible enough that the people inside the organization can feel which way things are actually moving, as opposed to which way the memos say they're moving. Those are two different things, and the people who work in any organization always know the difference, even when they're too cautious to say so out loud. By the time autumn settled over the airport, leaves turning in the tree line beyond the perimeter fence, mornings coming in cold enough that the ground crews wore jackets on the flight line, Whitmore Aviation had not fixed all of its problems. It had a capital structure that was tighter than Claire wanted, and a reduced route schedule that had required some difficult conversations with regional partners. 2 administrative positions had been eliminated. The company's insurance premiums had increased following the FAA's corrective action plan, which was expected and budgeted for but still stung. What had changed was something harder to put in a financial report. Patricia Osei had been in the safety officer role for 8 weeks, and she had already done 3 things that Victor Langley's entire tenure had not produced. She had conducted an unannounced hangar audit, documented it fully, delivered the findings to Claire and the board without softening, and followed up 2 weeks later to verify the corrective items had been addressed. The second unannounced audit found 4 items from the first list resolved and 2 still open. She wrote it up the same way. No softening, no diplomatic buffering, just what she found. The first time it happened, 2 members of the flight operations team had complained to Claire that Patricia's process was disruptive and her communication style was abrasive. Claire had listened to both complaints fully. Then she'd said, "She's doing the job correctly. I'd encourage you to get comfortable with what that looks like." Neither person had complained again. Whether that was acceptance or just a recalibration of what was worth raising with the CEO was unclear, and Claire had decided it didn't much matter as long as the work got done honestly. The FAA investigation closed in late October with a corrective action plan that ran to 23 pages and required 18 months of enhanced reporting. It was not a light outcome. Robert Fitch had managed the process with the focused energy of a man who understood that the alternative, an enforcement action, potential certificate issues, the word investigation appearing in news coverage, was significantly worse. Gerald Park, the FAA investigator, came in person to deliver the final determination and walked through the corrective action requirements with Claire, Patricia, and Caleb in the conference room with the scuffed table. When he was done, he closed his folder and looked at the 3 of them. "Off the record," he said, which was a phrase that people in regulatory roles used when they wanted to say something true without it appearing in any document. The voluntary disclosure made a significant difference in how this was handled, that and the documentation trail. He looked at Caleb specifically. If those records hadn't existed, this conversation would be happening in a very different context. Caleb nodded. He didn't say anything. After Park left, Patricia opened her own notebook and started writing the implementation timeline for the corrective action items. She did this while she was still sitting at the table, before anyone had stood up to leave, because that was how she operated. The work started when the meeting ended, not after you'd had time to think about whether you were ready for it. Claire watched her and thought about Victor Langley, who had also been efficient, also been action-oriented, also moved fast. The difference was not in the speed, it was in what direction the speed was pointed. But the board meeting in November was different from any board meeting Claire had run before it. She'd been running them for 4 years, and they had always had a specific texture, careful language, managed information, a kind of institutional politeness that kept conversations in a range where consensus was achievable and discomfort was minimized. This one had Patricia Osi presenting the safety audit results directly to the board, unfiltered, which was a structural change Claire had pushed through in October, and which Patricia had embraced with a thoroughness that initially made 2 board members visibly uncomfortable. It had Harrison Walsh nodding with the specific satisfaction of a former pilot watching someone do pre-flight checks the right way. It had Patricia Dean asking sharp questions about cost timelines that were actually useful rather than obstructive, because the information she was working from was real. After the formal agenda was done and most of the board had left, Walsh stayed behind. He did this occasionally, lingered after meetings to say things that he apparently judged were better said without an audience. "You look different," he said to Claire. She was stacking papers into her folder. "Different how?" "Less like you're managing the room," he said. "More like you're actually in it." She thought about that. "I'm not sure I know how to take that." "Take it as a compliment," he said. "Managing the room is a skill. Being in it is harder." He put on his coat and left, and Claire sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes with the particular quiet that follows a meeting when the actual work was done in the actual meeting rather than around it. She'd forgotten what that felt like. She wasn't sure she'd known what it felt like. Not really. Not until now. Tmam. Caleb's official title by November was Director of Flight Safety Operations, a position that Claire had created not because it looked good on an organizational chart, but because the functions it covered had previously been distributed across 3 roles in a way that allowed each of them to assume someone else was handling the critical pieces. The title consolidated the accountability. Caleb had agreed to it after reading a 2-page job description that he'd requested in writing and reviewed over a weekend before saying yes. He still worked in the hangar. That had been his condition, and Claire had accepted it without negotiation, because it was correct. A director of flight safety operations who didn't have his hands on the aircraft was a different and less useful thing than the person Caleb actually was. His role now included the oversight and documentation functions, but it did not replace the work on the floor. He had a desk in the glass-walled office. He used it for about 2 hours a day. The rest of the time, he was in the hangar. Danny Okafor had been promoted to lead technician for the regional jet line, which was both deserved and slightly overdue. He'd taken the role with the combination of visible pride and immediate anxiety that suggested he understood the responsibility, which was the right response to a promotion in aviation maintenance. In a quiet moment one afternoon, Caleb had stopped by Danny's new workstation area, a designation more than a physical change but meaningful, and said, without ceremony, "You've earned it." Danny had looked at him. "I froze up when they walked you out," he said. "I want you to know I know that." "I know you know it," Caleb said. "That's enough." "Is it?" Caleb thought about it honestly. "It is if you don't freeze next time." Danny nodded. It wasn't absolution exactly. It was something more useful, a standard clearly stated going forward. The first aircraft to complete a full maintenance cycle under the new system, new reporting chain, new documentation protocol, Patricia's safety review, Caleb's sign-off, copies to Claire's office, and the board safety log, was the Bombardier CRJ from Bay 7. Tail number that had carried a yellow caution flag on the morning everything changed. It was cleared for return to service on a Tuesday in early November, and its first scheduled flight was a morning regional run, a route the company had operated for 11 years, short enough that it was easy to overlook, and long enough that the people on it were going somewhere that mattered to them. Claire came to the hangar that morning earlier than she needed to. She wasn't sure why exactly. The aircraft didn't need her there. The crew didn't need her there. But she came anyway, in her coat and a cup of coffee that was already going cold, and she stood near the open hangar doors and watched the ground crew complete the pre-flight. Caleb was there too. He'd been there since 6, which was not unusual. He was standing with Pete Grillo near the hangar entrance, both of them watching the same thing Claire was watching with the same quality of attention. Not ceremonial, not performed, just watching, because it was worth watching. The flight crew arrived. The captain was a woman named Denise Farrow, who had been with the company 7 years and who moved through pre-flight with the economical precision of someone who had done it enough times that the ritual had become second nature without losing its meaning. She walked around the aircraft, checked what she needed to check, spoke briefly with the ground crew lead, and then climbed the stairs. Before she did, she looked toward the hangar and caught Caleb's eye. She gave him a short nod, the kind that carried information without words, an acknowledgement between people who understood the same things about what it took to get an aircraft to the point where someone trusted it enough to climb inside. Caleb nodded back. Pete Grillo said, "You going to watch it go?" "For a minute," Caleb said. They stood together as the Bombardier was towed to the taxiway, and then as it moved under its own power toward the runway, and then as it lined up and held and then accelerated and lifted, cleanly, without drama, the way aircraft lift when everything is as it should be, and climbed into the gray November sky and became small and then became invisible in the overcast. Claire watched it go. She thought about all the flights that had taken off from this airport over the 31 years her father had been building this company, and all the people on all of them who hadn't known anything about maintenance logs or shimmy dampers, or the difference between a reporting system that worked and one that had been quietly bent to serve the wrong purpose. They'd just bought their tickets and gotten on the plane and trusted that the people responsible for it had done their jobs. That trust was not a small thing. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before, or hadn't let herself fully hold the weight of. It was the entire foundation of what the company existed to do, and it turned out the foundation had been compromised in ways she hadn't known because she hadn't looked carefully enough, and because she'd trusted the wrong person to do her looking for her. She wouldn't say she'd earned back that understanding. You didn't earn understanding like that. It was given to you by circumstances, usually painful ones, and what you did with it afterward was the only part that was actually yours. The company's annual safety report, issued in December, the first one since Patricia Osei had joined, was 41 pages long. The previous years, issued under Victor Langley's oversight, had been 12 pages and had contained a summary assessment of satisfactory compliance across all operational domains. The new one contained 7 findings, 3 of which were classified as requiring immediate corrective action. All 3 had already been addressed and documented. The report didn't bury the findings in language designed to make them look smaller than they were. It stated them plainly, stated what had been done about them, and stated the timeline for verification. Claire sent it to the board with a cover note that was 3 sentences long. This is what honest reporting looks like. It will always look like this going forward. I want us to be a company that can handle that. Harrison Walsh emailed back within an hour. His email was 1 sentence. Your father would approve. She read it twice, then closed her laptop and went down to the hangar. On a Friday afternoon in mid-December, Caleb's daughter Maya came to the airport. It was the last day of school before winter break, and Caleb had arranged, through a process that had involved more logistical negotiation with his ex-wife than he'd anticipated, to pick her up and bring her by before they drove to his apartment for the weekend. Maya was 11, and she was exactly as Caleb had described, dark-eyed, skeptical of things she hadn't decided were worth her attention, and apparently genuinely committed to the marine biology ambition, because she'd arrived with a library book about deep-sea ecosystems that she'd been reading in the car and that she carried into the hangar with her while looking around with the mild interest of someone visiting a parent's workplace as a social obligation. Caleb gave her the abbreviated tour, which mostly involved walking through the hangar and explaining, briefly, what various things were. Maya asked a few questions, not the questions of a child performing curiosity to please a parent, but the specific questions of someone with a scientific inclination who had noticed something that didn't make sense to her yet. "Why does that one have a different color tag than the others?" she asked, pointing to a routine maintenance flag on one of the 737s. Caleb explained the color coding system. Maya absorbed it, filed it somewhere, and moved on. Danny Okafor crossed paths with them near the tool room and introduced himself with the slightly awkward formality of someone who didn't often interact with 11-year-olds in professional settings. "Your dad's kind of the reason this place is still running," Danny said. Maya looked at him. Then she looked at Caleb. "Is that true?" "That's an overstatement," Caleb said. "It's really not," Danny said. Maya considered this. She looked at the hangar around her. The planes, the tools, the fluorescent lights, the controlled purposefulness of the place, with the evaluating gaze of someone who was genuinely trying to understand something. "Do you like it?" she asked Caleb. "Like, actually like it?" He looked at her. It was the kind of question children asked that adults tended to deflect with some version of "it's complicated" or "it pays the bills," which were answers that were true and also weren't the real answer. "Yeah," he said. "I actually like it." "Even when it's frustrating?" "Especially then, kind of," he said. She thought about this with the serious processing speed of a kid who didn't accept incomplete answers. "That's weird," she concluded, but she said it without judgment, the way you describe something that didn't fit your existing categories but that you were willing to leave in its own category for now. Caleb smiled. It was an unguarded smile, the kind that appeared on his face when he wasn't thinking about how he looked, and it made him look considerably younger than he did the rest of the time. Claire, passing by on her way back from a conversation with Pete, saw this from 20 feet away and kept walking without interrupting. There was no single moment that resolved everything. That was the truth of it, and the stories that described transformation in terms of a single turning point were simplifying something that was actually gradual and imperfect and frequently unclear from the inside. What had happened at Whitmore Aviation over 4 months was not a clean arc with a satisfying finish. It was a series of corrections, each one small enough that you might not notice it if you were only looking at any one of them, but accumulating in a direction that was unmistakably different from the direction things had been going before. The company still had financial pressure. It would for some time. The route restructuring had steadied the cash position without fixing it, and the next 18 months would require continued discipline and probably some decisions that nobody was going to enjoy. 2 of the 4 board members who'd been installed through Victor Langley's network had resigned in November. The remaining 2 had, in different ways, adjusted their positions. One toward genuine engagement, one toward a watchful neutrality that at least wasn't obstruction. Victor Langley had, through his attorney, reached a severance settlement with terms that Robert Fitch described as achievable and that Claire had signed without dwelling on. The question of Marcus Vale's involvement, how deliberately constructed the arrangement between Vale and Langley had been, and who had initiated it, was something that the FAA investigation had noted and referred to other authorities. That process was ongoing and would be for some time, and Claire had accepted that she might not see a conclusion to it for years, if ever. That was unsatisfying. She was learning to sit with unsatisfying. What had been resolved, actually resolved, was simpler and in some ways more important than any of the institutional complications. The aircraft were maintained honestly. The people responsible for maintaining them had a clear and protected path to report what they found. The person at the top of the organization had stopped managing from a distance and had started listening to what the building was actually telling her. These things sound obvious stated directly. They sound like the minimum. In practice, maintaining them required continuous attention because the pressures that had allowed them to erode in the first place, the pressure of deadlines and investor expectations and the seductive logic of efficiency, didn't go away. They were structural features of running any company, and the only real defense against them was a culture that had been built, deliberately and imperfectly, to push back. That culture was what Caleb Mercer had been trying to hold together alone for 8 months before anyone above him understood what he was doing or why it mattered. He hadn't succeeded by the measure of changing the company while he was being quietly managed out of it, but he'd succeeded in the way that mattered most. He'd kept the record. He'd done the work and written it down and kept the copies, and when the moment came that required evidence, the evidence was there. In January, Claire stood in front of the full company staff, maintenance, flight operations, ground crew, administrative, everyone, in the main hangar on a Tuesday morning that was cold enough that people's breath showed in the air near the open doors. She'd thought carefully about what to say and had ultimately thrown away 2 drafts and decided to say the true thing directly. "I made a serious mistake this year," she said. "I trusted the wrong person with too much authority and didn't ask the right questions about what was happening in this building. That mistake put this company at risk, and it put our passengers at risk. And I want to say that clearly to everyone in this room because you all deserve to know that I know it." The hangar was quiet. Hundreds of people looking at her, and the honesty of what she'd just said was a different kind of quiet than the silence that comes from people waiting politely for something to be over. "What didn't fail," she continued, "was one person in this room who kept doing his job correctly when the structure around him was designed to make that difficult." She looked toward where Caleb was standing, near the back, next to Pete Grillo and Danny Okafor and the rest of the maintenance team. Caleb Mercer documented everything, fixed what needed to be fixed, and refused to sign off on an aircraft he believed wasn't safe, even when his job depended on doing the opposite. That's the standard I want this company to operate at. Caleb, for his part, looked like he wanted to be approximately anywhere else. He was standing with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, in the manner of someone who understood that the attention was necessary but didn't particularly enjoy being at the center of it. Pete Grillo, standing to his left, was looking at the floor with a small and private expression that might have been pride or might have been something more complicated, the recognition of a man who knew he could have done more and was watching the outcome of what happened when one person did. Danny, to Caleb's right, was not trying to hide anything. He looked like what he was, a young man who had been changed by watching someone do the right thing in a sustained and costly way, and who was still in the process of understanding what that meant for the person he intended to be. When the gathering was over and people began dispersing back to their work, Caleb made his way toward the hangar exit with the directness of someone trying to get through a crowd without being stopped. He almost managed it. Claire caught up with him near the side door, the same one he'd walked out of on the morning he was fired, with the cardboard box under his arm and the photograph of Maya in his breast pocket. "I know you hate that," she said. "I don't hate it," he said. "I just think the work is the point, not talking about it." "Both can be true," she said. He considered that. "Maybe." She put out her hand. He looked at it for a half second and then shook it. A firm, brief handshake, The kind between people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side with a working respect that didn't need to be performed. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting this place fall apart while I wasn't paying attention." He looked at her with the level gaze she'd come to understand as his default. Not cold, not warm, just honest. "Pay attention going forward," he said. "That's what I need from you." "I will," she said. He nodded. He pushed open the side door and walked out into the cold January morning, and the door swung closed behind him. Outside, the flight line was already moving. Ground crews were working. An aircraft on the far end of the taxiway was cycling its engines in the pale morning light, the sound of it carrying across the concrete in the particular way sounds carried in cold air. Clear and present and immediate. Caleb stood there for a moment and listened to it. There was a specific thing about that sound that he'd never been able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't grown up around it. It wasn't beautiful, exactly. It was too mechanical for beautiful, but it was purposeful in a way that very few things were. A sound that existed because something complex and demanding had been maintained correctly by people who understood it, and who understood that the people inside it were trusting them to, and who took that seriously enough to get it right. He stood there in the cold and listened to it, and then he went back inside to work. The planes weren't going to maintain themselves. They never had. They required someone willing to show up early and stay late, and write things down and refuse to sign their name to something they didn't believe was true, even when everything around them was organized to make that inconvenient. That was the job. Not the title, not the office, not the recognition that had come too late and that he hadn't particularly needed anyway. The job was to know what you were looking at and to say so, to keep the record, to put the yellow flag on the landing gear and hold your ground when someone asked you to remove it for reasons that had nothing to do with whether the aircraft was safe. It was not a complicated thing. It just required being the kind of person who did it even when no one was watching, even when the institutional pressure ran in the other direction, even when the cost was your livelihood and your security and the comfortable fiction that if you stayed quiet, the problems might resolve themselves. They didn't resolve themselves. They accumulated. And then, eventually, they became something larger than anyone had planned for, and the question was always whether the person who had been saying so all along had kept enough of a record to prove it when the moment finally came. Caleb Mercer had kept the record. That was all. That was everything. And 22 aircraft were flying today because of it.